Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and I have been the Carb Addiction Doc for 22 plus years. It's very interesting in the evolution of the low-carb ketogenic space. It's really interesting to have been part of this journey since the Atkins days. And you know what's interesting is Bobby Atkins was actually a cardiologist. He was a cardiologist, and he very rapidly realized early on in his work that the problem here was not eating fat, it was eating sugar. And he focused very heavily and did amazing work in a very hostile environment with what was called the Atkins diet. It started out with net carbohydrates. And as he worked with net carbohydrates, people had extraordinary success, not only in losing weight, because the target there was obesity. And the correlate was that obesity caused heart disease, caused diabetes, caused gout, caused PCOS, caused all of these problems. So the target of the Atkins diet was to lower net carbohydrates and reduce obesity. And by reducing obesity, you reduce disease. And that was a very plausible concept, because the way net carbohydrates worked is that net carbohydrates are the carbohydrates that get absorbed from the human by the human body. And the other carbohydrates do not get absorbed. They pass through the human body. So a little bit naive in that thinking, because now we know it's total carbohydrates, but not completely naive. However, he was the forerunner, the precursor. There were a few people before him, and in fact, our entire experience as a species predated that. We just went off the rails a little bit. However, net carbohydrates have been so bastardized by people trying to sell us stuff with big language of net carbs in the front, and they do all this mathematical gymnastics to sell us cookies and chocolate bars that are supposed to be healthy for us. That's all bullshit. But the evolution started with net carbohydrates, and then, as I've watched this over the last 22 to 25 years, the target was obesity. And the ketogenic diet took over from where Atkins left off, mostly total carbohydrates, and some of the early work was all done to treat obesity. So the target was caloric reduction, and sustainable caloric reduction by not eating sugar and starch. That was the starting point. And in fact, in our own practice, we did that. We did that with our bariatric surgery patients, where the surgery was about the weight loss together with a low-carb diet to sustain the weight loss. And the focus was on low carbohydrates. And really, we didn't care so much if it was higher protein or higher sugar. But the interesting phenomenon that's happened is, number one, as we've understood and watched a whole ketogenic population grow, is we've become more specific about carbohydrate elimination to the point where we're now seeing carnivores, people that have been eating a carnivore diet for many years, who are fat adapted, insulin sensitive, and doing very well on a carnivore diet. But we've also seen the evolution of metabolic disease reversal in general, whether that's cardiovascular, whether it's diabetes, whether it's polycystic ovarian syndrome, whether it's autoimmune disease, prevention of dementias, prevention of cancers. So skin disease, eye disease, gynecologic disease, abnormal uterine bleeding. So we've seen the evolution of a low carbohydrate way of life being pervasive in so many different biological arenas, in a good way. But the latest trend, the newest trend over the last several years has been, and it's kind of funny to see how this happens, more and more people jumping on the addiction bandwagon and seeing carbohydrates as drugs, seeing carbohydrates as addictive. So they say, oh, carbohydrate addiction, I got a carbohydrate addiction. It's carbohydrate. It's actually the first group of people talk about food addiction. Oh, I've got a food addiction. It's food addiction. And I don't want to be, you know what, screw it. I am going to be arrogant here. I am going to be a little bit on my pony here. But those are people that are coming along for the ride that have no clue. They still approach low carb from a dietary perspective, but they're throwing around this word addiction, and they have no clue what it is. So in this video, that's a long way to talk about this, but in this video, I want to be specific about my insights about addiction. And this comes from the trenches over the last 22 years plus personal insights. And I think it's so important that if we're going to use that word, we understand what it is and what it is not. It's just been bandied around so much, and it's being bastardized, and that's my concern. I don't want the word addiction to become the same word as paleo, the same word as some of these other diets that have come and gone that kind of mean the same thing. So let's break this down and let's understand the nature of addiction. Okay, first and foremost, the identification of addiction typically starts with the harm that the drug does. Every single drug, every addictive behavior has its own unique subset of harm. If you're a heroin addict, you're turning blue and trying to die. If you're a crack addict, you've all seen their teeth and of the trying to crack crystal meth. You've seen the teeth. You've seen those issues. You've seen what opioid withdrawal does. Heroin addiction. If you're an alcoholic, it typically gets evident by the time you've had your 5th DUI, you're now starting to get liver disease, or there is disruption in the family. If you're a smoker, you're looking at lung cancer, lung disease, cardiovascular disease. Every drug has a unique set of consequences. And the addiction, the overuse part, is typically diagnosed by the addiction. When you have diabetes, when you don't smoke and you've had significant cardiovascular disease, when you're obese, severely obese, I'm not talking about 5 or 10 pounds. That's a bowel movement for me. I'm talking about 50 plus pounds of excess weight. When you start living in a smaller and a smaller prison because of your excess weight, and you're getting rid of things that every human being should do, like crossing your legs, because you're too fat. That's where we start with addiction. Addiction starts with a recognition of harm. If there is no harm, there is no addiction. There may be abuse. Lord knows, I've abused alcohol in my time. I've got hammered, I've passed out, I've been drunk, I've puked over my 50 plus years on this earth. But I've abused alcohol from time to time. I am not an alcoholic. I have full control of my drinking. And that's not just me saying so. So there's use, abuse, and addiction is exclusively defined by significant tangible harm. The other part about addiction is that the label addiction can be used when you've reached a point where you no longer have the capacity to control that relationship and never will. If you ever try to control your relationship with carbohydrates and are successful, you're not an addict. Because there's no alcoholic out there that controls their drinking. There's no smoker out there that controls their smoking. Those two words, control and addiction, are diabolically and inherently opposed to each other. Addiction means the absence of control. And therefore, addiction management is about distance. But all diets ask you to tightly control a relationship you do not have the capacity to control. How's that going to work? Well, it's great on good days, but not on bad days, folks. And bad days are where you're invulnerable. So addiction has to have harm. It has to have the loss of control. And then the third part about addiction is, why do we go to the point of addiction? We get to the point of addiction when we never developed or have comprehensively lost effective emotion management strategies. By the time you're an addict, if you look in that addict's emotion management toolkit, there's basically carbohydrates and cobwebs, or nicotine and cobwebs, or alcohol and cobwebs. They really do not have effective alternative emotion management strategies. They may have had them, but they're not using them right now. They've lost them. They've let them go along the way. And what's left is this relationship with an instant gratification substance. Now, let's talk about, so I'm working this backwards, okay? So let's talk about the substance. Let's talk about the substance. By definition, an addictive substance or an addictive behavior has to give you an upfront instant reward. And the reward comes by the activation of the endorphin system, the series of chemicals in our brain that give us an instant sense of tranquility, an instant sense of relaxation, whether it disturbs your mentation or not. So clearly, heroin and fentanyl disturb your thought process. So does alcohol. But nicotine and carbohydrates do not. You're able to function. So it's not about dysfunction, not obvious dysfunction, not loss of mental clarity. But it is about almost an obsessive compulsive need for that drug in excess, and it's about creating a whole relationship where you are continuously and opportunistically looking for access to your drug to mitigate, to activate that endorphin system to mitigate against emotional tension. And addiction is a dysfunctional way of managing emotional need. Every day, throughout the day, all human beings are encountering anxiety, stress, depression, anger, fear, frustration, sadness, boredom, and pleasure. And in order for someone to have an addiction, that substance, that behavior has to give you instant gratification, an instant form of endorphin relaxation, an instant way of dissipating your emotional tension. Because, I'm depressed, I'm angry. It's not about depression or anxiety or stress, folks. Everybody has the same. Some days it's worse, some days it's better, some days it's different. But it's never about stress, depression, anxiety, boredom, or pleasure. It's about the tools we have in our toolkit to handle it. And the addict has a wonderful singular tool to obliterate, like a baseball club, all emotions. So they don't have to know what the hell they're feeling. The feeling is irrelevant. If you've only got one tool, one hammer for every nail, it doesn't matter what the hell the emotion is. You just know right now I need some ice cream. Right now I need a cigarette. Right now I need a drink. Because we feel the emotional tension irrespective of what triggered it. And we take a hit of that readily available substance that we have a close relationship with. Smoker's never far from a cigarette, the alcoholic's never far from a drink, and the fat person is never far from a carbohydrate or a snack. So if we've got that, and it's so effective, why the hell do we need anything else? So even if we started out our relationship with carbohydrates as a dominant way, but we had other things, as that relationship grows, the other things fall away. And as we become fatter and sicker, we're not able to participate and do those other things. So by the time significant tangible harm has happened and you've lost control of the relationship, but you distort the reality of the harm to continue the relationship, and you do not have effective other emotion management strategies. That's addiction. And by definition, addiction has to be to the substance that triggers the endorphin effect. Nobody ever got a buzz from water. It's alcohol that we drink for pleasure. Water we drink for hydration. So when an alcoholic says, I quit drinking, no, they didn't. They'd be dead. They're still drinking water. They just say they quit drinking alcohol. And the same is true with food. It is impossible to get fat from eating food because the human body has very tight self-limiting consumption of protein and fat. Yes, you can gain weight with fat. Yes, you can gain weight with protein. There are plenty of bodybuilders out there who are pretty much carnivore, who bulk up, but they're not obese. And weight gain and obesity are very different. Arnold Schwarzenegger's BMI when he was Mr. Olympia was 38.3. He lived at a BMI of 37, severely overweight. He didn't have a lot of fat. That's not obesity, folks. That's just muscle. And we know he did it with steroids, but be that as it may, that's muscle. It's not fat. So yes, you can gain weight eating protein and fat, but you don't become obese because you will not overeat it. You will not overeat it, and it won't cause harm. So food cannot be addictive. But there is a drug that is still prevalent in our food system that's been shoved in there by politically corrupt people and by industry that refuses to acknowledge the harm that carbohydrates do. And those carbohydrates have been shoved into the food system and sold as healthy. In the same way that the tobacco industry now sells vape to young kids, and 50% of high school kids vape on a regular basis because tobacco companies said, hey, it's a cool way, it's not going to cause harm, it's smoking that's bad, we're not selling cigarettes anymore. All right? Not only is vaping harmful from a nicotine perspective, psychologically it's devastating. It's devastating because it's a highly addictive drug that precludes that child, just like with carbohydrates, from having a healthy, diverse emotion management system. That vape, that snack, whacks anxiety over the head like a baseball club. But they don't deal with their anxiety. They're just obliterating it. And that's not a healthy way to live. So addiction management is a very dysfunctional way to live, even before it's caused significant harm. The other part about addiction is that every emotion, every anxiety, every stress, every depression is triggered by an issue. There's always an underlying issue that triggers that need for something. And when you're using an instant gratification system, that cigarette, that little squirt of heroin, that little cupcake, it's very effective at instantly giving you tranquility, instantly obliterating the emotion. But it disconnects you. It disconnects you from acknowledging, identifying, and processing and dealing with the issue that caused the emotion. So what we do is we take those issues and we shove them into our subconscious, and I'll deal with them later. It's called psychological hoarding. So we never deal with issues. Why do you think all these high school kids are full of anxiety and depression and they're vaping and eating carbohydrates? Because they don't have an effective, diverse, effort-based emotion management system where they put out the flames of the anxiety while they're processing the issue that caused the anxiety. They have no capacity to deal with the issues. So what they do is shove all those issues into their subconscious. Those issues fester and they use more and more drugs and develop more and more dysfunction to be able to survive. So they become less effective as human beings. And addicts, by definition, are less effective than they could be because they don't deal with and process the issues effectively. That's addiction, folks. That's addiction. It has to be an endorphin activating substance. If it doesn't activate the endorphin system, it is not addictive. Number two, the relationship has to have progressed to a point where there is no longer and never will be control. And that usually happens after significant, tangible harm has happened that is a direct consequence of the particular drug, and the person is distorted, minimized, trivialized, rationalized, and ignored the harm in order to continue the dysfunctional relationship. That's addiction. And if anybody out there is bandying around the word, oh, I'm an addict, or, oh, you've got an addiction, a food addiction, ask them what the hell they mean by that. And if they cannot quantify it, they don't understand. And if they tell you you have to control your addiction, they sure as hell don't understand, because by definition, us addicts have lost the capacity for control. We're going to do a series, folks, of discussing addiction. This first series is just to denote and understand the word addiction. But the next episode that's going to drop is going to talk about the full expanse of carbohydrate addiction. And this is something that most people do not understand. Even the people that say that carbohydrates are a substance addiction. That's bullshit. That is not true. That's a piece of the truth, but it isn't the whole truth. The next video on carbohydrate addiction will give you my insights into the broad spectrum and why this is such a toxic, difficult addiction to deal with. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. Throw darts at me, throw compliments at me, understand what we're doing. If this has made you think, I've done my job. But please leave comments below. Please hit the like or the dislike button. I don't care if you hate what I've just said or love what I've just said. Hit the thumbs up, hit the thumbs down. Help us out because we'd like to get this message out there. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. If you want to know more, text us to 561-517-0642 and we can set up a medical consultation, because I am an addict myself, but also a practicing medical doctor, which a lot of the people on the internet can't say that they are. They're armchair pundits.